So it is, and here's Shira. Shira is also in Tel Aviv, so it's wonderful to have them here. Shira has just recently started at the Benyamini Art Center, an online ceramics magazine in Hebrew. And she's hoping that she can get enough funding to get it translated into English so that we'll all have access to it. Which will be nice. What if you, before we start here, what if you get articles in English? Shira.
Well, hi, everybody. Good evening. Well, it's almost midnight here.
Oh.
But I drank a lot of coffee today. So we do have English articles that we get and translate to Hebrew, but right now our website is designed only for Hebrew.
Okay.
It's a different design, okay. and
yeah.
For, now we don't have the budget for this, but hopefully in the future.
Yeah, good. Well, we'll keep track of that. Okay,
yeah, sure.
We're going to go ahead and get started here, and I sent a link to, or well, just his how to look him up online. I didn't find a personal website for you, Sequoia, but I wanted people to see all that list of every place where they can learn all about you and see your work and all of that. So as most of you know, Critical Connections is dedicated to encouraging and enhancing critical writing in the field of ceramics. And our funding, so that I can pay the guest speakers, comes primarily from our generous donor, Linda Lighton, but other people have also contributed, Anna Kaluri Holcomb, etc. over the 2.5 years now that we've been doing this. So it's wonderful to see you all here. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sequoia.
Hello, thank you, Elaine.
You're welcome. If everyone would mute yourselves, that would be great. Then we don't have until we're ready to have our discussion. Thank you. Go ahead, Sequoia.
Maybe for now, maybe for starters, you can start off muted. Hi, it's wonderful to be here. It's really a treat to be part of the group. I haven't been able to join one of the sessions before, but I've been on the on your email list. I've been aware of all the great conversations that you're having and have been having. So it's wonderful to be here. My plan is to kind of follow the form, what I understand to be your typical format, which is that I'll speak pretty informally for about 20, 25 minutes, something like that. And then we can have kind of an open conversation after that, if that sounds good. I see some familiar faces here, which is wonderful. So hi to all of you who I've met in person. I also see a few folks who I've corresponded with over the years. So it's like great to see you in person as well, and some new folks. So looking forward to the conversation. I didn't have a real strong sense of who participates in this group. So again, I just put together some images, and at Elaine's request have sort of tried to string together my really kind of my interest in what I think has been curious about ceramics in the way that I've been working, which is both, well, initially from a studio point of view, and then from an academic, and now from a more museum oriented perspective. So my thought was to trace sort of my way of thinking about ceramics through my biography, actually, because of those three sort of areas of contact. So that's what I plan to do. Let me see if I can share my screen. Give me a second, please. Okie doke. So I am sharing screen. Everyone can see. This looks fine. Yes. Some nods or some thumbs up. Yep. Okay, great. So again, yeah, I'm happy to be here. My name is Sequoia, and yeah, I'll kind of jump into it. So I started off as a studio potter. Actually, I was a full-time studio potter for about 15 years. I was based in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I lived in Washington State. So here's a picture of me as a very young, slender man getting started with my studio pottery career. And I had begun actually making studio pots a little bit unexpectedly. When I was in university in the US, I actually studied art history and cultural studies, and initially thought that I would go into a career in museum work, actually. But after interning in a few museums, I decided actually to go into ceramics. I had taken a number of pottery classes as a kid, but had not really identified it as, actually, I hadn't really identified it as a complex endeavor. I thought that it was just like kind of a pretty straightforward thing. And then when I started taking classes again after finishing university, I realized that in fact, actually it has this incredible depth and complexity. So I pursued my ceramic education more in this sort of adult education kind of learning context, both within academic situations. So like I was living in New York City, where I'm from at the time, and began just taking classes, both at places like Greenwich House and then also places like Parsons, and really kind of expanded my investment and commitment to working in clay. After a number of workshops at places like Penland and Haystack, I then decided to just kind of set out on my own. So that's what you're seeing in this image here is me kind of getting started in one of my first studios in the Pacific Northwest. For me, it was very much a removal from the urban environment of New York City and out into the woods. I had my studio on Puget Sound, which is a beautiful kind of saltwater area. And you're starting to get a sense in the other image of the kind of pots that I was making and was interested in making at the time. So for me, my interest in clay was very much about actually wanting to make work all the time. I was very keen to be a full-time studio potter rather than to be, to say, have an academic source of income and then make work to kind of complement that. So it was important for me to be, as I say, a full-time studio potter. I made quite a lot of work. I would sell it through galleries, through shops, out of my studio. I did a handful of craft fairs over the years. I was very, I guess the important pots and potters that were interesting to me were the ones that had influenced quite a lot of folks who were keen on studio pottery, particularly in the English-speaking world. And so that would have been, of course, the influence of Bernard Leach, kind of the Leach tradition broadly conceived. In the US, it came to me through folks like Randy Johnson, Warren McKenzie, Will Ruggles, Douglas Rankin, and in particular, the studio potter, I am just blanking on his name, Michael Simon, the potter Michael Simon in Georgia. He was one of my teachers early on, and I was really kind of encountered both him and his work at a very impressionable and influential time for me, and was really moved by both the kind of work that he could make, but also the kind of life that it could embody. So again, as with many potters, it was both the object itself, but also the life and the whole lifestyle, and sort of my understanding at the time of what it meant to live an ethical life and to live a meaningful life. The kinds of pots that I was interested in making were sort of on the order of what you're seeing here. So, high-fired stoneware, reduction-fired, kind of understated glazes. Again, kind of riffing off of American versions or interpretations of that Leach tradition. I would say for me, I always felt a little bit coming from New York City and coming out of an art history and cultural studies background, that my work had a little bit stronger of a design sensibility than a number of the other kind of Leach influenced potters who were active certainly at that time and prior. As I continued to work in my studio over the years, I found that I was very sort of satisfied by the exploration of making, again, quite a high volume of work. But I found it really challenging to explore my intellectual interests. Part of what I found engaging about studio pottery was trying to understand like what the meaning of the objects were and how those objects both took on new meanings, lost old meanings as we use them, and thinking about older objects, that process as extended through time, how meanings are accrued, aggregate, and are shifting over time. And I felt that I did not actually have a very strong intellectual framework for really pursuing those questions at a complex level. So starting in around 2008, I began sort of self-directed reading. And it was interesting and engaging, but it was also hard living in the woods and not really being part of any kind of structure, not having, I mean, I had friends and I had pottery friends, but I didn't have like a community of folks to talk to. Email, of course, was around, the web was kind of getting rolling in the late 90s, but there, of course, was a very different kind of volume of information that relative to what is, and connection relative to what is available now. So I read on my own for a couple of years, and then I finally decided to start an MFA program, which I had resisted for a handful of reasons for quite a few years. And after a couple semesters in that program, I realized that in fact I was much more interested in the historical and theoretical questions around ceramics rather than the studio-based questions. And that led me toward thinking more about art history, or thinking back actually toward art history as a discipline or as a methodology, a framework for exploring my questions about, again, how meanings accrue and aggregate in objects. So I looked around for a program for a bit and ended up at the Bard Graduate Center in New York City, which I imagine would be familiar to a number of you, probably. The Bard Graduate Center is this wonderful, amazing, freestanding, really, institute on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It is affiliated with Bard College, but really functions independently. And the thing that makes Bard so unique and amazing is that it's dedicated to the study of objects. And I think as many of us will know and perhaps have struggled with over the years, kind of the way of understanding both ceramics as a medium, but also like vessels and pottery and domestic utilitarian ceramics within art history, has been fraught at times and hasn't been always super clear about how to frame questions around ceramics and pots in particular within art history. So for me as a starting point intellectually, the BGC was great because it really approached the study of objects from a wide range of vantage points. Art history certainly, but also cultural studies, anthropology, design history, all these different methodologies that were brought to bear on these objects. So for me, it was a wonderful time of shifting gears away from this kind of very dedicated studio work to a time of reflection, of writing, of thinking, of research, and of history. So I'm showing you images here of just the building itself to give you a sense of location, but then also one of the monumental Delftware vases that was owned by Queen Mary in England in the late 17th century. So that would have been William and Mary, who were the kind of joint regents in England. And having come from the Netherlands, they had an elaborate collection of Delftware, and in particular monumental Delftware. And I was interested in these works, how they started to express political power, actually. And for me, these kind of research projects were important in unpacking some of the cultural, social, political, and economic layers that are kind of embedded into ceramics in a sort of deeper history. The other image that we're looking at is a picture of Bob Briscoe, who's a potter in Minnesota, maybe familiar to some of you. He's been in practice for a long time. And Bob is one of the generation of studio potters in the late 1960s and 1970s in the US who really kind of took the ideas of Bernard Leach that had been developed in the 1920s, really, and then started to be circulated more in the 1940s, took these ideas in the 1970s and really ran with them, really started to live by these kind of somewhat problematic principles or ethics advocated by Leach and the Leach school. And I was really interested in how this generation of potters, why these ideas of Leach were important and resonated with this generation, particularly in the anti-Vietnam War context and in the sort of American youth counterculture context. Very old ideas appealing to a very young crowd. And in fact, this generation of potter who were students and then became active in the late 60s and early 70s were also among the instructors that I had. Folks, again, like Michael Simon, who were attracted to ceramics, to handmade ceramics and utilitarian ceramics in particular, as a way of life, as well as an artistic practice. So, so this kind of work in the 1970s became the subject of my thesis at Bard Graduate Center. So after a couple of years at BGC, I was interested actually in both continuing on the academic path and in broadening out the methodology from an object-centered discipline to one within a frame of art history. So I enrolled in the PhD program at Yale University in art history, principally because among art history programs in the US, that's one of the relatively few, more now, but relatively few that embraced material culture studies, decorative arts history, and the study of objects. So for me, these disciplinary and methodological questions have always been really important in terms of being aware of and thinking about and critical about how we frame our questions around objects. When do we take sort of where in the sense of in what context are the methodologies of art history useful and productive for thinking about ceramics? And when do they fall short? And then when they do fall short, what other methodologies and approaches do we have to framing questions? So at Yale, what was great was being able to think about ceramics within, in particular, this art historical context. And one of the main projects that I worked on during my years there was an exhibition called The Ceramic Presence in Modern Art. And that was presented at the Yale University Art Gallery in 2015 and 2016. And the real sort of thesis for the show was that the story of ceramics unfolds within the context of art, really, of fine art, of painting, sculpture, photography, works on paper. That ceramics, many ceramic artists over the years have had these very deep and long-standing connections with other disciplines, and that there's something to be added by exploring these connections alongside a sort of dedicated exploration to the field of ceramics. So I think my approach has been mostly a sort of both and approach. The idea that the history of ceramics as its own discipline is valuable, interesting, complex. The history of ceramics within this broader area of practice is also interesting and complex, and that we as practitioners can devote our energy and our resources to both. So the way of exploring this thesis at Yale was actually really straightforward. It was just adding ceramics to the permanent collection galleries in many ways. So what you're looking at are again, the permanent collection galleries of modern and contemporary art at the Yale University Art Gallery. And you can see in the image on the right, in the foreground, we installed 3 works by Toshiko Takayasu, widely known and celebrated Japanese-American ceramic artist from kind of the second half of the 20th century. And we're seeing her works alongside, I guess from left to right, and kind of the middle ground, painting by Mark Rothko, Myron Stedman Stout is a small one, and then Robert Motherwell. And really the argument here was very simple, which is that Takayasu's work can be fruitfully understood and encountered within the context of abstract expressionism. It was important to her as one of the sources for her work, and her work is in conversation with objects like this. The image that's in the middle shows a number of works by Ken Price, of course, the American sculptor based in California and New Mexico. And what we're seeing here are a number of his later works. And just in the background of that image on the right, over my cursor, you can see a couple of prints by Ed Ruscha, who's also a very well-known and widely celebrated American artist who was very friendly with Ken Price, and they were part of the same kind of clique, the same crowd of kind of dudes in LA in the 60s and 70s, making very kind of slick artworks, and trying to articulate here some of the relationships and connections between, again, a sort of disciplinary, specific practice within the discipline of ceramics, but in this broader context. And I'll flag that the vast majority of the ceramic works from that were in this exhibition came from the collection of Linda Leonard Schlenger, which is why we were able to have so many fabulous Ken Price sculptures all in one place, which was a real treat for me. So I finished up at Yale in 2018 and came to Toronto and started working at the Gardiner. And the Gardiner Museum, again, may be familiar to some of you. It was founded in 1984 by George and Helen Gardiner as a ceramic art museum. And it was founded on the collections of George and Helen Gardiner. George Gardiner was a businessman based here in Toronto. His wife was Helen Gardiner, second marriage for both of them. And when they initiated their relationship, they became, one of the things that they started to do together was to collect ceramics. And so they began a little bit gingerly, but then got more and more invested into the whole endeavor, both the acquisition of the objects, but also the exploration of the whole field and the meaning of the objects. Helen Gardiner then attended the Sotheby's program, so she had a little bit of training there, and they amassed a collection that centered in a handful of collecting areas, those being principally 18th century porcelain and European porcelain, and you're seeing kind of the entry to the European porcelain galleries here at the museum. They also collected Italian Renaissance Maiolica, European Delftware, and ceramics from the ancient Americas. So rather than collecting global ceramics, they really focused on their areas of interest, and those became the core collections of the museum. In the intervening years, since the early 1980s, the Gardiner has added other collecting areas. So we now have Japanese and some Chinese ceramics, but I think most significantly, modern and contemporary ceramics are a huge part of our work at the museum, both in terms of collections and exhibitions, and is part of the reason why I'm here. I'll speak now for a couple of minutes about some of our recent exhibition projects at the museum as a way of framing kind of my current thinking about really about the Gardiner in a way as a platform or as a tool or as a way for kind of moving further into questions related to ceramics, and then some of the things that I think are interesting about clay right now. Everyone still with me? Yeah. Okay. Great. So got your mute buttons on for now. Okay, so let's see. Here are just a couple images from two pretty recent exhibitions that we've presented at the Gardiner, and I wanted to show these side by side as a way of characterizing the range of our work here at the museum. So the two images on the left that you see are from an exhibition called Raw, which we presented in 2020. It opened just before the pandemic, so it had a little bit of audience time then. And then, of course, March 2020, more or less everything shut down and then opened up again and then closed down again and then opened up again and closed down. So it didn't quite have like a run that we anticipated, but it was on view for a good chunk of time, and many people saw the exhibition. And this was one that I curated, and I was interested in this project in exploring this phenomenon of contemporary artists who are using clay as a medium, particularly as opposed to ceramics. So unfired clay, or clay, which is also unfired clay. And so what we did was we selected 4 artists who have an affiliation with Canada, because as I started to think about kind of look more closely at the phenomenon of artists working in this mode, I realized that a number of them actually were Canadian or had ties to Canada. And as a kind of a national ceramics museum, the ways in which we can have a Canadian lens and understand Canadian practice within an international context feels important. So you're looking in the larger image at 2 works. So the cube that you see there is a kind of a 10 by 10 plexiglass cube that was part of a performance work in sculpture by an artist named Castles. The inset image actually shows the artist Castles during the performance of the piece. So the artist was suspended from a harness, which you can see kind of hanging from the ceiling. The interior of the box was coated with clay, and the performance consisted of the artist kind of swinging back and forth in this kind of acrobatic state of suspension and tearing the clay off of the walls of the box. The piece thematically had a lot to do with visibility, with sort of birth and rebirth. It also had a sort of funereal aspect as well, and a sort of assertion of physical presence. Castles is based in LA, but was originally from Montreal, and is a trans artist whose work often deals with a sort of with their relationship with their body and the sort of visibility and physical representation of their body. Castles is also very much an athlete, a bodybuilder, weightlifter, and so the sense of these sort of strategies or tools of engagement and duration are significant to their work. So the performance was something that we presented before the opening of the exhibition as a kind of special one-night event, and then the remnant from the performance became the sculpture that was part of the exhibition, along with a video component. The piece that you see on the wall kind of behind it is actually a part, maybe I'll blur my screen a little bit later, but it's an installation by an artist named Magdalene Dijkstra, who is based here in Ontario. And this is a work of raw clay that really is about infestation and about the role of humans in the planet. sort of ecological work, kind of biological work, and she's taking our presence on the planet and representing it almost like an organism, like a biological organism. Over the run of the exhibition, this installation, the wall installation, grew. So it started out as a small infestation, became a larger one. There were these unexpected resonances between this kind of this metaphor of infection and, of course, the pandemic, which occurred at the same time. Yeah, these again are two of the four projects that I think try to represent some of the, I think, really interesting ways that artists are using unfired clay. So that was 2020. One of the next exhibitions, actually the next major exhibition that we presented was called Renaissance Venice, Life and Luxury at the Crossroads. And this is a historically grounded exhibition that was curated by our other main curator here, Dr. Karine Sumas. And this exhibition was really premised on thinking about Italian Renaissance ceramics, in particular Maiolica, and its role within the broader visual culture of Venice. Venice at the time, of course, was this incredible crossroads between East and West, where there was ceramics from the Far East, there were Ottoman textiles, it was metalwork. It was really a kind of a cultural crossroads of exchange between these different communities and these different cultures. The exhibition really tried to unpack both how that crossroads functioned, particularly in relation to our own experiences now with the kind of globalized economy and these multi-ethnic, multi-dimensional cities that many of us live in, like Toronto. So that kind of crossroads idea on the one hand, and then the notion of the role of ceramics within this broader visual culture and relating to this broader visual culture rather than as a standalone discipline. And so you can maybe make out that there's a number of other objects in the exhibition. We had paintings, we had quite a lot of lace and glass work, a lot of other textiles. And it was really, I think, a beautiful and very interesting show that really spoke to the richness and complexity of ceramics, again, within this broader visual language. The inset image here is a work by Nadia Mir, who's a Canadian Indigenous artist. And I included this to point to the handful of contemporary works that were included in the Renaissance Venice exhibition. I feel like as a museum, one of our really powerful possibilities is to really toggle between the contemporary and the historical to have a deeper understanding of both. Of course, the way that we frame this contemporary practice is in many ways a struggle with the legacies of the past. We don't just arbitrarily make plexiglass cubes and are suspended within them, but we're thinking about both the recent past and the deep past. And so how we understand our present really relates to how we understand our past. And of course, how we understand our past and projects like Renaissance Venice is all about what questions we have in the present, of course. And as we're mainly a group of historians, it seems like this will not be news to anyone at all. But part of what I think, again, is interesting about the Gardiner is our ability to work in both of those zones. So many institutions, especially smaller ones, have kind of limitations in that regard. Of course, as a museum, our largest restraint is that we're a ceramic museum or ceramic art museum. And in a way, I feel like that gives us this incredible kind of lens or filter that's very narrow in the one hand, that really all of our projects relate immediately to ceramics, but it's also incredibly broad because, as we all know, ceramics is so ubiquitous and has been for such a long time. I'll have an image now of an exhibition that we presented earlier this year, a Canadian artist named Sherry Boyle. She's really drawing explicitly from a lot of ceramic history, principally European, also using a lot of structures and metaphors and themes related to the theater to explore this idea of the presentation of self and how we see ourselves, and again, how we struggle with this legacy, with these legacies from the past. I'm happy to kind of speak more about the details of any of these projects, but just kind of wanted to give you an overview of some of our recent work at the museum. I wanted also to speak a bit to our permanent collection galleries. One of the kind of longer term projects that we're looking at the museum is ways to think about interpreting and encountering our historical collections, again, through a contemporary lens. different parts of the historical collection have been reinstalled at different times. And the bulk of the porcelain galleries were reinstalled in 2015. And we've since now started to reinterpret various sections of this larger gallery. So what I'm showing you here is an area that features ceramic objects from the 18th century that are centered around tea, coffee, and chocolate consumption. And I highlight these because we recently changed the interpretation in this gallery to really focus on the colonial aspects of these objects. The fact that all of these objects appeared initially, of course, in elite European households because of colonialism, because of plantation economies and global commodity trades and the rise of chattel slavery, all of these systems that are very, for a long time, I think, were very easy to not discuss in terms of historical ceramics. But I think now many of us recognize that it's just such a rich and fruitful area to investigate some of these questions, mainly because so many of us have relationships with teapots in one form or another, and because so many of the forms and images really embody a lot of these economic, political, social, cultural questions. I think this might be my last slide. So finally, I wanted to feature two other images relating to projects, recent projects here at the museum that I think point to kind of some of the directions that I think are both interesting and important for us to be working on. So the two images on the left relate to an artwork titled Talking Earth. This is a piece by a Canadian artist, Santi Smith. I should actually say an Indigenous artist, Santi Smith. And this work is a piece that we commissioned as a public artwork. It actually stands, it's installed in the front of the museum. And this is a work that was commissioned to both celebrate and honor ongoing Indigenous presence in Canada and Toronto, across Turtle Island. Of course, the conversations around indigeneity, Indigenous kind of presence and visibility has been changing globally substantially in the last number of years, and in particular in Canada. I feel like this is, I think many of us feel like this is a really important aspect of our work now at the museum, working in this territory. And being able to kind of lead the visitor's experience with an encounter with this artwork feels like a great way for us to do this among a kind of multi-pronged approach. What you're seeing in this other image is a performance. So Santi Smith is an amazing artist in that she's a dancer, choreographer, and ceramic artist. She is of the Mohawk Nation, and actually her grandmother is well known in Canada for having revived Mohawk ceramics in the 1950s and 1960s. And the image that you're seeing above Santi Smith was part of the performance, and it was a projection of an image of her grandmother as I guess, a middle-aged woman making ceramics, and Santi Smith sort of relating her own work to her matrilineal kind of history looking backward, but also she performed with her daughter, who is the second figure here, and thinking about the role of ceramics within her own family tradition and with the tradition of her people and her nation. So really trying to develop kind of tools and strategies and platforms at the Gardiner for cultivating a number of these stories. The last image here on the right is an image from something that we call ICAF, or the International Ceramic Art Fair. And this is an initiative that we began a couple of years just before the pandemic at a small scale, but we presented in an expanded form in 2022. And this is something that we're kind of getting off the ground. And this is actually an art fair that we are trying and trying to expand and promote. And we feel as a museum that one of the ways that we can advance awareness and conversation and dialogue among about contemporary ceramics among a broad community is to in fact develop the marketplace for ceramics. So we are looking at presenting ICAF every year. We have it scheduled in June for every year. How it's structured, what kind of work it will feature will vary from year to year, but as you can kind of get a sense from this installation shot, we present it not as a traditional art fair with sort of booths for each particular artist or gallery, but rather we're presenting it as an exhibition. It's like a salon style fair, we could say. And this is a way, again, to bring artworks in conversation with each other. So I think that's all that I will say about that for now. But look out in the future for more info around the Ceramic Art Fair. And I am going to thank you all for your attention and stop sharing my screen. And now I can see your faces more.
Great. Thanks so much, Sequoia. Wow, what a venture you've had, going from being a functional potter to a curator. And what intrigues me is the depth and the breadth of ceramics that you have covered here, which keeps expanding as the art world keeps expanding. And you used the word toggle when you were talking, and I see you have toggled. But one of the things that I wrote down initially was you're talking about the ceramics connections with other disciplines and the juxtaposing of those works. And yet, and I think I've talked about this with this group before, but the fact that we still cling to our material specific publications it's a dilemma, I think, because it gives ceramics writers a venue, an outlet for their writing, and gives ceramics makers an opportunity to expand their knowledge about what's going on in the ceramics world. And yet it can tend to encourage a myopic viewpoint of people in the ceramics field. And I'd like to have you comment on that, because obviously you've gone from being a functional potter to now a curator of these conceptual and contemporary works. And I'd like to have you comment a little bit on that, and then we'll kind of open this up.
Yeah, sure.
Everyone.
I mean, I think dilemma in a way is a good word for it, in the sense that in the sense that we have these two kind of perspectives that are connected to each other and related to each other. I don't think that it's always problematic, though, actually. I think that that these ways of looking and thinking and writing can coexist with each other. I think for me, it's in my own kind of story, it's less the studio to academic / museum kind of toggle than the within ceramics and outside of ceramics kind of toggle. And I think that, again, I would, to the extent that we can, I would advocate for a sort of both and approach, where it's important to be able to speak in, contexts such as this one, where there is a focus on ceramics, right? Or to publish in, journals or whatnot, where the focus, or to speak in departments, say, where the focus is on ceramics. At the same time, again, as I'm saying, I think that we do need to be able to function in a broader context as well. I think that there are really, really important ways of seeing, thinking about, and understanding ceramic work that's very much within that disciplinary conversation. There's a certain kind of specialist kind of interaction that you can only have in that framework. If that's the only framework that we value or pursue or find kind of a way to think in, that's when I feel like it can get a little bit stultifying. Where any one of us is, I think, on that spectrum kind of depends, because it has to do not just with what we feel the studio needs, but I think what motivates us, individually. Some of us like really just are more invested in that. I think of it almost like a family conversation, like a within the family sort of conversation about the medium and the questions that pertain to the medium. And some of us are more interested in kind of dipping in and dipping out. So I mean, not to sound trite about it, but like, it's all good. We just need to like kind of keep doing it, be patient and like tolerant and accepting of our questions and our work. I don't know. So what does the group feel
Good
about
answer.
this question? And
We'll open it up. Anyone have questions or comments about what Sequoia was talking about? Jenna?
I'm just curious, like you've done a lot of great work in the museum and in your career of the ceramics context, but I'm just wondering how you build like how the Gardiner and how you as a curator build community or develop projects that can expand that community and bring other people into the world of ceramics?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And one of the reasons that I decided to go into museum based work rather than academic work exclusively is that museums are accountable to the public, right? It's like we're a public facing institution. So I should say that the Gardiner is affiliated with the University of Toronto. We're completely independent, but we're on University of Toronto land, actually, kind of property. So we have a relationship with them. I teach a little bit at the University of Toronto. So there is an academic dimension really to all museum work, of course, but in this context in particular. But that public facing part is really important. And I think for a long time, for many museums, and certainly at the Gardiner, the attitude was that kind of didactic, paternalistic attitude of you come to the Gardiner to learn how to value, ceramics, how to pick up a teacup, the difference between Meissen and Sèvres. It was almost like, not to overstate it, but it was a little finishing school like it was a little bit like how to learn how to be a refined and educated, often woman, right? Like now I think we have a very, very different approach. It's kind of obvious. In terms of building connections to communities, that's a huge part of our focus. We do a ton of education and programming work. I only spoke to the exhibitions here, but for both independently and related to the exhibitions, we have both an education and a programming department that foregrounds work that builds relationship with communities and reacts in response to what communities need and what, what's happening. I would say during the pandemic, that was one of the upsides of all the upheavals and terrifying stuff of the pandemic was that it really helped us, I think, become a better community partner, because we were able to really hear and understand where our partners were at and kind of what they needed and to react in that way. At the same time, we also developed greater facility with a lot of virtual platforms like this one, of course. And so we've been able to pursue a number of projects virtually. So for example, right now we have a series of workshops that we do with isolated communities in the north in Canada, where we actually ship pallets of clay up, to these very small Inuit villages, and then have classes on Zoom with kids in the north. So that's like to me, it's an incredible project that we would not have been able to do without all the weirdness of the pandemic. So yeah, these kind of community connections and stuff are hugely important. And I think as a last note to your question, I'll say that, what I always say is that we all have a relationship to ceramics. I actually firmly believe that almost all of us love ceramics, just most of us haven't realized it yet. So probably the people on this call have realized it. Like basically everybody who comes into the museum, they have some ceramic thing in their life. They have a relationship with some ceramic thing in their life that has meaning to them. And so what I try to do, for us to do with the museum, is to build on that, is to draw with that very intimate, actually loving, I would say, connection to the medium that almost all people have.
That's great. And Janet Mansfield, Janet Koplos has her hand up, and I appreciate going to the reaction and put your hand up. That way I can keep track of who's in line. Janet? Oops.
Okay, I'm trying to do this on my, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm doing this on my phone and I'm having trouble with connections and with the pictures. So it's been a little bit piecemeal, but anyway, my question, Sequoia, and it was wonderful to hear what you had to say, and nice to see you again. But when you talked about pottery, you talked about living the life according to Leach. And then when you talked about what you put these sculpture works within the context of why the two of those. I mean, why pottery have been discussed in art history?
Oh, Janet, I really want to hear your question, but I only heard a little bit of it. Did anyone else hear most of it and can
No, it
paraphrase?
was,
there's
you're
a
breaking
problem.
up. You're breaking up, Janet.
Can we try once more?
Maybe
Yeah.
without the picture. Maybe try
Yeah.
to close your picture.
Good idea.
Well, let me try it. Okay, let me try it again. The question.
Oh,
Perhaps she can type
Um,
it.
yeah, maybe you
You
could put
spoke
it,
of
put it in the chat.
or Bob Briscoe. You were talking in terms of living, and the show there, you showing sculptural works. Okay. Are you hearing me? No?
Janet, I'm sorry, we're
Oh,
only
dear.
hearing a teeny bit of you. So what I would, can I ask that either if you could, I know you're on your phone, so it might be hard, but if you can type the question either into the chat or maybe into an email to Elaine, then we can try it that way.
Yeah, good idea.
Okay,
Okay, Dee Wood had her hand up.
okay, I'll try.
Dee. Unmute yours, yeah.
Yeah. As the original designer of all the exhibits at the Gardiner Museum, I would like to object to Sequoia's view that it was a, a tea party. He kind of was jokingly talking about the setup of the museum. And I just want to remind him that in 1984, when George and Helen put the exhibits on display, that there was nothing like it in Canada. So the fact that their displays were kind of orthodox, it was not only a showing of their collection, but it was also an introduction to Canadians and certainly to North Americans and people from other parts of the world of this fantastic collection of porcelain and pottery. So a very formal, non-interpretive display theme was entirely appropriate. And as the world has changed and as the ceramic community has changed, I think it is, I think that what you're doing is appropriate, but I take exception to disparaging remarks about what happened back in the 1980s.
Thank you for the comment, Dean. Point well taken. So I did not intend my remarks to be disparaging, certainly. And I would agree that there, different times call for different actions, kind of, and different ways of thinking. And we all build off of the work of our predecessors. Like there's no way around that, absolutely. And so this notion of kind of how we think or write about or interpret anything is really specific to kind of where we are and where we're coming from. I think absolutely that so I would broaden it out a little bit from the Gardiner and say that, and encourage us to think about, for example, decorative art scholarship, or even scholarship on studio craft, if we think about the 20th century. I think that in the 1970s, kind of, but especially the 1980s and 1990s, kind of 70, well, I think if we're thinking about decorative arts, it's kind of from the 60s to through the 80s and into the 90s, that the need was for there to be a mapping, right? The couple of generations of scholars in there needed to like identify the work and kind of map it, because nobody knew like how many different objects Dupaquier porcelain manufacturing made. Like nobody had any idea what their scope of endeavor was or scope of production was. I see Janine's on the call, right? And so like the work at the American Craft Museum was hugely important because nobody knew like how many silversmiths were, working in the rural areas of New Mexico. And like, it's like, you just have like, the urgency was to really map the field. So Dee, I think in your framework, your comment of like, there was nothing like the Gardiner at the time. Absolutely, it was about kind of mapping and introducing in a way, and that the needs have shifted. I think that one of the incredibly admirable so I'd have two more things to say about this. One of the incredibly admirable aspects about about the work at the Gardiner is that it was like, for a small museum in a relatively kind of I don't know what I was, so in Toronto, let's say, it was remarkable that the staff here was able to have such kind of a dedicated and scholarly endeavor for so many years. So Meredith Chilton was the founding curator here. She made incredibly scholarly contributions to the field of decorative arts, to porcelain studies in the 18th century in particular, to Commedia dell'arte, all of these areas that again were so understudied that nobody even had any idea what like existed. So that's really key. I think there's one other really important piece to mention, which is that the Gardiner, while in many ways being traditional, let's say, just in shorthand, also had this incredible like experimental streak from like really the late 1990s, doing these really kind of visionary programs of, and building connections with communities, that having work all over the city, really doing very, very non-traditional works. We've had connections with Indigenous communities for over 25 years. So a lot of the, it wasn't all about it being like a white glove finishing school. Certainly there was a huge amount of academic work that was done here that was productive and that a lot of people have built off of. And there was also this kind of experimental streak that I think is in the DNA of the institution as well. So
Very
thanks.
good, good response. And when Dr. Wendy Gers had her hand up. Wendy?
Thank you, Elaine, and thanks, Sequoia, for a really interesting talk. My question to you is really almost following on from Dee's, is what are your current demographics? I'm working at the National Ceramics Museum of the Netherlands, and we struggle, we're not in a huge metropolitan area, and we struggle with demographics in terms of our primary clientele, if we want to call it that, or our visitors are primarily 65-year-old white women with their friends, and their friends are inevitably 65-year-old plus white women. They don't even bring their partners. So yeah, I'm curious, how you guys have, museums have changed and continue to change in those visitor profiles. Yeah, for us, it's a trick. It's tricky because we've got a much older constituency and a very aging population. I'm just curious, who are your primary visitors?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And it's a tricky one. So on the one hand, we don't have excellent visitor data, I'll say. Like, we're too small of an organization to actually have like comprehensive visitor data. So it's much of it is anecdotal, and it's a little bit about like who you see in the galleries as you're going around and who we think are our primary constituency. So that said, I would say, yes, we absolutely skew toward the white, toward the older, toward the well-off, for sure. I would also say that being in Toronto, which is an incredibly diverse city, we do have quite a diverse audience, and we often will have sort of a full representation of the GTA, what we call the GTA here, the Greater Toronto Area, within the museum. So we can we do have quite a varied audience. I think a lot has to do with programming, frankly. So we had an exhibition of Ai Weiwei, obviously like kind of a celebrity artist, brought in huge visitor numbers, as you can imagine. But one thing that was amazing to see during that exhibition was the number of people who would see like a contemporary art show by like an international art star, then wandering through the porcelain collection galleries or the collection of Japanese porcelain and saying like, oh my God, this work is incredible, and that was amazingly rewarding. So I would say that I found that the more diverse our programming has been, and the more sort of the stronger our community outreach has been, the more diverse audiences have been coming in to the museum, for sure. I think the other sort of dimension of that question has to do with sponsorship. And for all of us who are at institutions, there are these really profound questions about how we fund the institutions and who are the patrons and sponsors of our organizations. And that absolutely skews, the models of philanthropy are different in every country, certainly, but they differ generationally. So there's a number of questions around who cares about us, I would say, is that broader question from audience, and how they care about us.
Mhm.
Could you unpack that a little bit more? I mean, do
Around-
you have BP and really problematic sponsors?
No, so we don't. So one thing that I'm very grateful for is that we don't have any arms dealers on our board or manufacturers, which is great. That's one of the upsides of working in Canada, I suppose. So it's less about that and more that I would say in the kind of previous couple of generations, there was a different kind of model of philanthropy and there was a different model of collecting ceramics, as I'm sure many of us know. The idea of like the person who is really dedicated to collecting only ceramics is not as strong now. So that's not as strong in the contemporary realm and it's not as strong in the historical realm. So a number, really the vast majority of the supporters of the museum over the first, say, 20 or so years were these kind of ceramics collectors, like people who say collected Meissen or Sèvres or Commedia dell'arte figures and were absolutely like dedicated to that and dedicated to, you know, that kind of collector like obsession of like the just all of those questions. And that was such an important foundation to the museum, both in the volunteer core, but also in the on the patron space too. In the contemporary context, it's the same thing. Like I'm sure many of us are dealing with that transition from, say, people like Linda Leonard Schlenger, who I mentioned, who is a ceramics collector who was active principally in the 90s and in the early 2000s. There aren't a lot of people like her now. Just the collecting patterns are different. So who is going to care about a museum like the Gardiner has changed and is changing. And I think our way of working with communities is mission driven, but it also relates to this change. It also speaks to the need for an institution like the Gardiner to really be of the city of Toronto and not just for, you know, kind of geared toward people who identify themselves as having a pre-existing interest in ceramics.
Great, thank you. I have Janet's question now in the chat. And she says, pottery interested you in terms of living, the ethics of Leach, etc. But at Yale, the show was ceramic sculpture in relation to art history. What about pottery in relation to art history? Did you think of addressing that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a tricky one for sure. The exhibition at Yale was centered around sculpture, absolutely. There were some pots in there for sure, and there was a conversation with pottery. So one way that came through was the inclusion of Lucy Rhee and Hans Koper, who of course made sculptural-ish work, but absolutely identified as potters and did not call themselves sculptors. There was also work by you know, a number of those kind of Southern California guys would make pottery on this, like Billy L. Bankston. Nancy, are we missing Billy L. Bankston this this month? You know, a lot of folks like that, or Ken Price, who would make pots, but also within kind of a larger painting or sculpture practice. The sort of thrust of that show was not centered on pottery, and that was for a number of reasons. You know, principally around sort of the scope of work that was available for it. This kind of deeper question of the relationship of, say, studio pottery to the broader field of art history is one that I still don't, like, after all this time, I still don't like really fully understand. It's still like too complex. It's still unclear a little bit. One thing that has become clearer for me is that there is more of a meaningful relationship there. So I think of someone like Jim Melchert, right? California artist, conceptually based practice, photography, performance, all this stuff. His work is totally about pottery, like not everything, but a lot of his work is totally about pottery. And this is one of the pieces that I tried to think through in my dissertation at Yale, was how these artists who are not actually making pottery are using the logic of pottery, the logic of ceramics, of vessel-oriented ceramics. So Bruce Nauman, another one, he wouldn't identify himself as a potter. He didn't make pottery, but absolutely he's doing it. Or sort of, that's why I feel like clay and ceramics, and this gets back to that question of when is it important to have kind of the discipline specific conversation versus the interdisciplinary conversation. There is, to my thinking, a logic to ceramics. There's a way that ceramics leads us to kind of think and make and interact. And I feel like we artists can use that and not, strictly speaking, make ceramics, concrete, earthworks. There's a lot of ways to engage with that logic.
Great. And Nancy put her hand up.
Hi, Sequoia. It's so nice to see you. I wanted to just ask your thoughts on this idea of those pivotal moments. I think Glenn Adamson did that when he did his show at the MAD in New York on Peter Volkus. And in the course of my research and writing, you know, when you have, and you mentioned Jim Melchert, when you have someone like Jim, who's lived this incredibly long life, and at many points you can point, and many times you can point to work that he's done and say, well, that's pivotal too. So I'm wondering how, in your overall thinking, how that factors in. I think it does clarify some things for some artists, but I also, in my book, I'm toying with discussing this idea of the pivotal moment for many artists. And maybe you had a couple thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that I guess two things come to mind. One is what is his name? George Kubler's book from the 1960s, which proposes this idea of kind of primary objects. He has this sort of particular way of thinking, thinking very broadly about the history of art that advocates for this notion of these kind of primary objects that sort of shift our thinking, that become these pivotal moments. So that happens less within an individual's kind of career or life of making and more within a culture. So his work was really influential to a lot of the minimalist and conceptual artists that came up in the later 1960s and 70s. So I think that idea of a sort of pivotal object that shifts our thinking, that the Kubler book is a great way of maybe wrestling with that question. I think the other thing that comes to mind is the ways, and this is so clear with Jim Melchert's work, is the lack of clarity. Actually, what's clear is that we don't know what's pivotal in the moment, and that's what's so that's what keeps it interesting, right? So the work that's being made now will look very different in 10 years. What we think of as being important or interesting or engaging now will look different in 10, 15, 20, 50 years, because again, we make history that's useful for ourselves. We don't make it to honor the past, we make it to understand the present. So Jim Melchert, like what is pivotal for him, or the role or the meaning of his work, is becoming clear now because it's more important now or something. It's more, not that it wasn't then or not that it overly is now, but it just sort of we understand it better because of where we are now. So I think that there's something retrospective about that idea of pivotal artwork. Sometimes it happens in the moment for sure, but I think that there's often, I think within our own, like if we're makers, within our own making, we can understand these pivotal kind of moments in one way, but as historians or critics or advocates for the field or whatever our role is as a non-maker, maybe instructors, the identification of the pivotal moment, I think, is more often retrospective, according to the needs of the present.
Muted and I'm talking away. We're at the end of our hour, but I think what a wonderful conversation to have had, and what a great audience today. I appreciate all of you coming, and thank you so much, Sequoia, for putting this together. And our meeting next month will be November 17th, and I'll be letting you know who our speaker is. But I appreciate all you coming, and this was great, Sequoia.
Thank you, Elaine. Do we have a quick comment from Janine? Are you trying to say something before we log off?
Yes, Sequoia, thank you for noticing. I just wanted to add, I know the time is at an end, but I just wanted to say how nice it is to see you, although albeit not in person, and how thoughtful your answers are. I really have enjoyed the session. And also, for those of you who didn't see it, I did think that your exhibition at Yale was one of the most beautiful ceramic exhibitions I've ever seen. And I give you high points, high credit for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you. That's really kind. Lovely for you to say. Great to see you as well. I've had a great time. It's been really fun. I hope this has been interesting and fun for all of you.
That's great. We've all enjoyed it. There are some nice comments in the chat, and I've saved the chat, so I'll send that out. And then we will be putting this up on YouTube. So it's been recorded, And
We will? I didn't
will.
realize.
I will. We have a channel. It's Critical Connections in Ceramics and Craft. So
Good to
I'll
know.
send the link out and you'll have it then. Yeah. Okay. And I want to tell you all that somehow the recording of Malcolm Mobutu Smith disappeared. I was on a different computer, and so I'm still trying to find it. I'm not giving up, and I'm hoping I can get it up, but I was out of town and on a different computer, so my apologies. But thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to stop recording now.